In 1987, a miniseries called Out on a Limb aired on the American TV channel ABC. The show is based on the best-selling autobiographical book by actress and author Shirley MacLaine. It explored MacLaine's spiritual journey into beliefs like reincarnation, spirit channeling, and meditation, and her quest for finding a deeper, more meaningful life. It's now widely understood as a quintessential example of New Age spirituality. But what makes Out on a Limb New Age? From energy healing and polarity therapy to astral projection, crystals, aura reading, astrology, and chakra balancing, the term New Age encompasses a seemingly impossibly huge array of beliefs and practices. New Age is often thrown around as a vague term for the weird, as one Washington Post author put it back in the 1980s. Back then, and still today, many use the term New Age as a shorthand way to refer to any belief or practice considered to stand outside normal or mainstream religion. Now, religious studies scholars are more careful when trying to define it, but there is an ongoing challenge when studying the New Age to figure out what exactly we're talking about. Scholars generally use New Age spirituality to refer to a loosely cohesive cluster of beliefs and practices characterized by eclecticism and individually oriented practice. Personal experience is central, and there are many physical and mental practices that people use for achieving higher levels of consciousness, a feeling of oneness with the universe, centeredness in nature, or removing negative energy and cultivating positive energy. Though one particular scene in Out on a Limb can help us understand the New Age movement. In this series, Shirley MacLaine befriends this guy, David, a character representing all of her spiritual guides rolled up into one person. At one point, David and Shirley are sitting on the beach, and David explains that the reason people struggle to love themselves is because they don't truly know who they authentically are.
That's what all the masters have tried to help us with.
What masters?
You know, Christ, Buddha, the Indian avatars. They were really just master politicians who went right to the root of the problems in society, the individual.
Here David is expressing what religious studies scholars call perennialism, the idea that all of the world's religions share a foundational wisdom and truth. In this case, the truth that everybody is part of God. The kingdom of heaven is within us. But David says that unfortunately this can take multiple lifetimes to come to that simple realization. At which point Shirley asks,
Why isn't reincarnation in the Bible? Why isn't it taught in Christianity?
Reincarnation comes into the conversation, and David shares a pseudo-historical story that the Roman Emperor Justinian and the Church suppressed reincarnation because it implied that individuals needed to take responsibility for their own karmic destiny. Shirley responds that if she truly believed in reincarnation and karma, truly believed that everything she puts out into the universe would come back to her someday, she would be convinced that she is completely responsible for everything that happens in her life. The conversation culminates in David encouraging Shirley to affirm her divine nature by repeating again and again the affirmation, I am God.
I am God.
I am God.
I am God, an affirmation helping her fully embrace her own divinity. In this 4-minute conversation, we encounter several foundational concepts that characterize the New Age movement. Perennialist philosophy, the idea that a universal truth underlies all the world's religions. An emphasis on individualism, self-divinity, and self-empowerment. Belief in Asian religious practices like karma and reincarnation. Anti-establishment critiques of mainstream religions like Christianity. 4 historical streams came together in the 1960s and 70s that made this scene possible. Western Esotericism, the New Thought movement, the American youth counterculture of the 60s and 70s, and the Americanization of Eastern philosophies and religion. 4 historical streams that we need to understand in order to understand the New Age. Western esotericism and 19th century occultism are precursors to the New Age movement, especially theosophy, a philosophical and religious synthesis of several occult and esoteric traditions that was founded in New York City in 1875 with the establishment of the Theosophical Society. A core concept of theosophy is that beneath the surface of all this diversity, there is a foundational wisdom and truth at the root of all the world's religions, which, as I mentioned, is called perennialism. Theosophists blended concepts from Neoplatonism and Hermeticism with elements from Asian religions like Buddhism and Hinduism, like the concept of karma. These ideas carried forward for decades and inspired dozens of philosophical and religious movements, including the New Age. Believing in perennial wisdom lends itself to eclectic, individualized religious practice because it blurs the line between distinct categories like Buddhism, Hinduism, and Christianity. In other words, everything is up for grabs. You don't need to decide which religion is true and which is not, because truth is in every single one of them, and you can individually identify the truth in each wisdom tradition for yourself. Now, as we'll see later, this becomes a major part of the eclecticism and individuality of New Age practice. One of the most influential theosophists important to the history of the New Age movement was Alice Bailey. She foresaw an imminent era of peace and love, and based her reasoning on astrology. According to some astrologers, Earth would soon shift from the Piscean age to the Aquarian age. This means that during the spring equinox, the sun will rise in front of the zodiac sign Aquarius instead of Pisces. A changing of astrological houses, or a new age, only occurs roughly once every 2100 years or so, and astrologers today don't even agree on whether or not we have entered the Aquarian age. According to Alice Bailey, the age of Aquarius was a reason for hopeful expectation, the expectation of an enlightened time when brotherhood and spiritual energy would dominate. And her ideas shaped the New Age movement later on in the 60s. For example, the famous Woodstock Music Festival in 1969 was originally branded as an Aquarian exposition. The opening song of the countercultural musical Hair was titled Aquarius, and included the refrain, "This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius." We also see this expectation of a new age in the book The Aquarian Conspiracy, by the prominent New Age thinker Marilyn Ferguson. Published in 1980, this book became a key text in defining and popularizing the New Age. She characterized the New Age as a conspiracy, in the sense of a peaceful revolution driven by a loose network of people united in bringing about collective awakening and a shift in consciousness toward a more enlightened and interconnected world. Ferguson was articulating a common idea in the 70s and 80s that an elect few will bring about this transformation, an idea that again stretches back to Alice Bailey. Bailey believed that small groups of people, what she called an oligarchy of elect souls, would awaken to this new age and help guide people towards spiritual enlightenment and a harmonious world order. Decades later in the 1970s, some started to believe in a generation of so-called indigo children, people believed to possess special and often supernatural abilities that are destined to bring about a transformation in human consciousness and society. In his book Revelation, The Birth of a New Age, the New Age thinker David Spangler introduced the concept of seed people, special individuals scattered throughout society, quietly influencing and preparing the ground for the coming New Age. So initially, the New Age emerged as a form of millenarian discourse, which means the expectation of a near-future transformative period, like a 1,000-year reign or a utopian era. In this sense, the New Age initially referred to an expectation of a literal New Age. Some New Agers interpreted this more radically, believing that the New Age meant a coming cataclysm, like what you would read in the book of Revelation, earthquakes, famines, and floods. Others were more moderate, saying that the New Age will involve a spiritual changing for humanity. Others argued that the New Age had already begun and we just don't realize it yet. Now, while this was a big deal in the 60s and 70s, eventually the millenarian aspect of the New Age faded a little bit. It never completely disappeared, though. For example, some of you might remember the expectation around the end of the Maya calendar in December 2012. Many people inspired by the New Age movement interpreted this as inaugurating a new era of spiritual consciousness or global transformation, and people even gathered at Maya archaeological sites to celebrate the event. But the millenarianism of the New Age eventually took a back seat to a focus on healing, manifestation, self-development, and health-oriented practices, which leads us to the second historical stream leading to the New Age, what's called the New Thought movement. Now, we talked about this in our video on the practice of manifesting, or the belief that your thoughts and intentions can bring about reality. New Thought was a diverse collection of practitioners in the 1800s and early 1900s whose work focused on the concept that each individual contained the divine spirit. This spirit was universal and made of the same stuff as God, or a universal power. Some branches of New Thought focused on stuff in a very literal sense. That spiritual matter was physically inside of you, which could be manipulated by using the powers of the mind to heal illness or energetic imbalances in your body. For example, figures such as Franz Anton Mesmer believed that the root of sickness lay in a magnetic fluid. Mesmer's practice of manipulating this hypothetical fluid is where we get the word mesmerize. And some scholars think that his fluid hypothesis laid the groundwork for how New Age thinkers conceptualize energy as a dynamic and malleable force often tied to health and well-being. Another key figure was Phineas Quimby. Originally a mesmerist, he eventually rejected the fluid hypothesis in favor of the idea that thoughts themselves could heal all sickness. Ideas like this led to what we now call holistic or mind-body medicine, which at the time was called mind cure. Mind cure swept through the US with the idea that the mind and body are connected, and your thoughts could affect your physical health. And decades later, we now have a constellation of self-help and therapeutic beliefs and practices commonly linked to the New Age movement, like the power of positive thinking, the law of attraction, and manifesting. In 1982, the New Age writer Shakti Gawain published Creative Visualization, a manual of techniques for manifesting the life of your dreams. By visualizing in your mind a clear idea or feeling of something you want, you can manifest it in your life, whether it's money, fame, or health. Affirmations, or strong positive statements that something is already as you want it to be, are a key practice in manifesting. For example, chanting the phrase, "I am a magnet for miracles," helps attract miracles to you. Shirley MacLaine was a huge popularizer of affirmations back in the 1980s, which we already saw with her chant, "I am God." We also see echoes of the New Thought movement when MacLaine declared that the law of karma means that she is completely responsible for everything in her life. This is a key theme in the self-help book genre and all the consumer goods that go along with it. Self-help is based on our ability to perfect ourselves to reach our highest cosmic potential. We can change ourselves for the better no matter our circumstances.
This was shared by other self-help authors like Louise Hay, declared Queen of the New Age by the New York Times Magazine. In her 1984 bestseller, You Can Heal Your Life, Hay listed out the points of her philosophy, one of which being the notion that we are 100% responsible for all of our life experiences.
Now, going back to the 1800s, as mind cure was gaining popularity, the academic field of psychology was also gaining traction, and some of these early ideas formed the basis of New Age worldviews. For example, a lot of you probably know about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which visualized human needs as a pyramid with self-actualization at the top, the desire to be the most that one can be. New Agers linked self-actualization to achieving higher consciousness, or expanding the mind's ability to understand truth.
This led to psycho-spiritual enhancement programs and institutes, like the Human Potential Movement, the Esalen Institute, and Erhard Seminars trainings, better known as EST.
So, ideas from the New Thought era shaped a worldview that later became a foundational pillar of the New Age movement, a worldview that emphasized personal experience and individuality, what we could call self-spirituality. The sociologist Paul Heelis explains that self-spirituality emphasizes personal experience and recognizing that the self is a spiritual being connected to all other beings. Again, an idea that we saw echoed in that conversation between David and Shirley on the beach.
This emphasis on self-spirituality, self-improvement, and therapeutic spiritual practices helped to shift the New Age movement from a form of supernaturalistic apocalypticism to what scholars call a this-worldly humanism that was all about human potential and self-actualization. Which leads us to the third historical stream of the New Age movement. The American counterculture of the 1960s and 70s, a period of American social, cultural, religious, and political upheaval where the New Age movement actually all began. So what was the countercultural movement countering? Well, normie culture, or the ideas and institutions that were considered normal, expected, and traditional for their time, particularly for white middle-class society. In the post-World War II era, this meant supporting progressive political issues. Countercultural youth, better known as hippies, supported the civil rights movement, gay rights, environmentalism, second-wave feminism, and sexual liberation. They also emphasized spreading peace and love, and they were vehemently opposed to the ongoing Vietnam War. It also meant saying no to the military-industrial complex, traditional gender roles, nuclear families, and corporate jobs, as well as patriotism, anti-communism, and saying no to the religions that they had grown up with, primarily mainline Protestantism and Catholicism, but also Judaism to a somewhat lesser extent. The 60s and 70s saw an explosion in a bunch of alternative beliefs and practices that eventually fell under this category of New Age. Just to name a few: meditation, postural yoga, Indian Ayurvedic medicine, chakra balancing, acupuncture, Reiki, mystical journeys with the help of psychedelic drugs, appropriating and reinventing indigenous sacred ceremonies, creating home altars, aura reading, spirit channeling, astrological and tarot card reading, and using crystals, essential oils, and incense for their energetic properties. Like I said, just to name a few. Scholars of religion consider this religious explosion of the 60s and 70s as a result of the countercultural ethos, the result of the baby boomer generation rejecting mainstream religions and embracing spiritual seeking. These practices were often viewed as alternative spiritualities defined in opposition to mainstream culture and religion. Remember David's pseudo-historical story about Emperor Justinian suppressing the belief in reincarnation. The New Age movement emphasized personal insight and interpretation of the truth versus received dogma. Much of this anti-dogmatism was directed toward Christianity, and pre-Christian or non-Western traditions were valued instead. The scholar Dr. Margareta Love writes, "The pre-Christian religions tend to be portrayed as more authentic, tolerant, and harmonious and in tune with the natural state of humanity and the earth than the dominant paradigm of the Piscean Age." As individuals embraced these diverse teachings and created their own spiritual beliefs and practices, they engaged in what the scholar Paul Heelas calls detraditionalization, which means rejecting the voices of authority associated with the established orders. Detraditionalization stems from the idea that the individual is the highest authority, over and against long-standing traditional authorities, even to the point of seeing oneself as divine. Again, we saw this attitude on display with Shirley MacLaine declaring, "I am God." Though we also see it in the purpose statement of the countercultural magazine, The Whole Earth Catalog. We are as gods, and might as well get good at it. In mid-20th century America, these were pretty radical statements. Detraditionalization explains the seemingly endless variety that we see within New Age spirituality. It indicates that those with a New Age mindset feel perfectly comfortable mixing, matching, and discarding ideas or symbols from any religious tradition. So you might come across someone who believes that their life is guided by astrological influences, practices yoga purely as an exercise instead of a Hindu devotional practice, and wears a cross or a Hamsa necklace, all without any contradiction. The countercultural ethos infused the New Age movement with a believing without belonging mindset. For example, in 1988, the Indian Guru Osho wrote, "You don't need any churches, you don't need any temples, you don't need any mosques. You need only a prayerful heart, a loving heart, a grateful heart. That will help you to discover not only yourself, but the very depths of this immense existence." So we can understand the emergent New Age movement of the 60s and 70s as a form of cultural criticism, reacting to the ideas and values which were perceived to have dominated Western culture since the advent of Christianity. Much of the New Age movement was framed as a counter to mainstream culture. The New Age of Aquarius versus the old Piscean Age. Individual spirituality versus church dogmatism, individual freedom versus social control. In many cases, scholars frame individuality and eclecticism as the defining factor of New Age spirituality, the eclectic mixing of astrology and manifestation practices, wearing symbols like the evil eye while espousing a fervent belief in the law of karma, or traveling to Thailand for tantric Sakyan tattoos, like what Angelina Jolie and Cara Delevingne have. Which brings us finally to the fourth major stream of New Age history, the rise and adaptation of Eastern religious traditions in the US. You might have noticed that a lot of the practice I've been mentioning so far derive from East and Southeast Asian religions. Practices like postural yoga, Indian Ayurvedic medicine, acupuncture, Reiki, various forms of meditation and visualization, and the belief in karma. Now, as far back as the 1800s, American esotericists like the Theosophists were incorporating ideas and practices from Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism long before they were cool. But the Americanization of Eastern religions really kicked into overdrive in the 1960s. In the late 1950s, Beat Generation authors like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg were introducing popular conceptions of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Taoism to American readers. Then in 1965, Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act, also known as the Hart-Celler Act. This law ended discrimination that had pretty much blocked immigration from non-Western countries. Since the 1920s, people from Asia had been barred from coming to the US, but now Asian immigrants could finally make the move, bringing religious beliefs and practices to a country that had little to no exposure to these ideas before. During the counterculture, celebrity spiritual teachers skyrocketed in popularity. For example, the Woodstock Festival was opened with a prayer from the Indian Guru Swami Satchidananda. Other celebrity teachers included Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the founder of Transcendental Meditation, and D.T. Suzuki, a Japanese-American writer and scholar who translated the philosophies of Zen Buddhism for the masses. New Age leaders also popularized new religious movements inspired by Asian religions, like Hare Krishna. This blend of what we could call new ancient wisdom is a hallmark of New Age spirituality. Now, new ancient might sound contradictory, but scholars note that New Age religious ideas resonated with white Americans because they felt new, even though the ideas were actually hundreds or thousands of years old. Fueled by perennialist philosophy, American countercultural youth were fascinated by the perceived similarities between these traditions, regardless of their cultural origins. They believed that teachings from Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and indigenous traditions offered timeless insights that could be easily adapted to modern life. And what began with hippies in the 1960s went mainstream by the 1970s, thanks in part to pop culture. In 1968, the Beatles traveled to India to practice transcendental meditation, inspiring their experimental White Album.
Jimi Hendrix decorated his guitar strap with tantric geometric designs called yantras, and Alice Coltrane began to mix jazz with Hindu devotional music. While the New Age of the 60s started as a countercultural movement of young people rebelling against the establishment, by the 80s the movement had become more mature, and along with maturity came commercialization. Many scholars see the New Age movement as a kind of spiritual marketplace of religious ideas, goods, and services. Seminars, meditation retreats, talismans, crystals, and at-home healing techniques transform spiritual seekers into consumers, and transform spiritual guides into ritual experts for hire. The scholar Guy Reddin even argues that commercial enterprises are the primary institutional form of the New Age movement, a network of festivals, publishing houses, magazines, therapy and retreat centers, and social media influencers. He writes, New Age activities are largely commodified in the fundamental fee-for-access sense. The scholar Margareta Love points out that this means we can apply the same tools that economists use to study markets to study the New Age movement. For example, we see the phenomenon of product standardization. In order to appeal to the widest possible audience, practitioners and organizations align their offerings with broad New Age values and adopt common terminology. A meditation app, a yoga studio, and a manifesting influencer on Instagram might all deploy the same terminology, like mindfulness or energy, effectively standardizing spiritual commodities across the New Age marketplace. Dr. Love also notes that in this commercialized environment, numerous actors compete for resources like memberships, subscribers, cultural legitimacy, and reputation. This competition leads to significant efforts to define and protect boundaries within the spiritual marketplace, ensuring that each actor maintains their unique position in a network of business competitors. Now, New Age ideas and practices have become so mainstream, it's tough to identify if a particular concept or practice is quintessentially New Age. In other words, over the course of about 15 years from the 60s into the 80s, by the time Out on a Limb aired on ABC, the New Age stopped being new. For starters, the baby boomers from the countercultural youth grew up and got jobs. They set aside their political fervor, but held on to the religious practices and vernacular from their New Age days. Even First Lady Nancy Reagan famously relied on her personal astrologer to help make decisions for President Ronald Reagan. By the 1980s, accumulating wealth was also often seen as a sacred spiritual achievement, an example of manifesting abundance. Scholars trace this phenomenon to the human potential movement and similar psychologically rooted groups like the Erhard Seminars training. These movements promoted the idea that personal growth and success were not just possible, but a sign of spiritual alignment and inner power. We see this play out today on social media with self-help manifesting influencers. Many other concepts that grew out of the spiritual boom of the 60s and 70s, like energy, auras, consciousness, and the collective nervous system, also found themselves transformed into vehicles for accruing wealth. The scholar Elizabeth Mickelson, for example, has outlined how the New Age concept of energy has been associated with money as a flowing and magnetic force. The author Shakti Gawain, who I mentioned earlier, associated money with a magnetic energy, almost like the magnetic fluid of Franz Anton Mesmer centuries ago. Because New Age beliefs and practices are not new anymore, but deeply ingrained in popular holistic health and therapeutic practices, many scholars have advocated for doing away with the idea of the New Age altogether. Also because it's become something of a pejorative term, a catch-all term for weird stuff. Ultimately, there's no official doctrine or definition of the New Age, and it's subject to our imprecise and changing notions of what constitutes it. But several historical streams joined in the 1960s that sparked something, a movement that made Shirley MacLaine's miniseries possible. Watching that conversation between Shirley and David, we can identify the marks of New Thought, with Shirley exhibiting the power of positive thinking and the divinity of the self, as she chants the affirmation, I am God. We see the perennialist philosophy of Western esotericism, as David shares that the old masters of the world's religions were teaching the same universal truth. And we see the anti-dogmatism of the American counterculture and the Americanization of Eastern religions as David excoriated the church for suppressing the belief in reincarnation and karma. The sociologist Robert Wuthnow theorized that the 1960s and the decades that followed marked a major shift in the American religious landscape, a shift from a spirituality of dwelling, where people stick with predetermined communities like churches or synagogues, to a spirituality of seeking, which was all about individual exploration and experimentation. Today, this seeking approach is pretty much the norm. More and more Americans now move between religious traditions, leaving the ones they grew up with, opting out of religion altogether, or identifying as spiritual but not religious, becoming spiritual seekers instead of religious dwellers. As we saw, the 1960s and 70s were a time when people were not just questioning their spiritual paths, but also the political structures around them. Today, political polarization is at an all-time high, and it's influencing everything. Everything from our worldviews to our news sources, clogging up our media diet with a bunch of partisan content. Which is why I'm always excited to introduce today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, and objective way to read the news. They aggregate stories from a bunch of different media outlets and pair those stories with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the sources reporting. For example, let's consider the religious controversy around the opening ceremony of the 2024 Summer Olympics. The ceremony featured a segment that seemed to evoke Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, with drag queens and others arrayed like Jesus and his disciples. The scene sparked backlash from some Christians and conservative groups who condemned it as a disrespectful portrayal of Christianity. So here Ground News has aggregated 270 media outlets covering the story. The story was picked up equally by right and left-wing sources, at 27% of the coverage respectively. Ground News enables you to compare the headlines with a click of a button, and it's very revealing how the stories are being framed. The conservative outlet The Daily Wire quotes a celebrity Catholic bishop. Bishop Robert Barron rips Olympics' condescending apology for blasphemous Last Supper scene, while the left-wing MSNBC headline reads, "The ridiculous moral panic over the Olympics opening ceremony." One of my favorite features is their blind spot feed, which shows you stories being ignored by one side or the other of the political spectrum. I like this feature because algorithms feed us content that we want to see, so we basically end up in media bubbles without even realizing it. If you'd like to give Ground News a try, Ground News is giving Religion for Breakfast viewers 40% off their Vantage plan. Go to ground.news/Religion for Breakfast or click the link in the description below to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.